what tools you use, how you use them, how they're configured, what data comes out of them, how that data gets stitched together, what process you then need to apply to keep it clean, to keep it consistent, and to get it on the right cadences. You can't figure any of that stuff out until you're clear on what the outcome is going to be. Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. Joining me again today is the one and only Kristen Kelly. Kristen, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Marcel.
It's a pleasure to have you back on the show. I feel like we've had a string of Carson appearances, so it's nice to have you back. You were enjoying a little bit of time off over the summer, which is great. Some time spent with family, so welcome back.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm about to be on a run too, so get ready. I think we're set for another string of Kristen.
Yeah, amazing. So the topic today is a question that we see come up that's posed directly to us, but also just sort of like an idea that we see applied to this problem of profit management pretty often sometimes by people that are considering working with us, and other times in people that are committing to working with us after having tried this and failed, which is this idea of, project management tools and the role that they play in profit management. And I think more broadly, the misconception that a better project management tool or a better PSA should be an adequate solution to this broader problem of profit management. So I think that's what we want to talk about today is like, why do people believe that? What are some of the challenges that come with that? And how do we think about the role that project management tools play in this problem set? They're important, but why they're probably not the answer to the real problem and the real question.
Yeah, I've seen this so much recently. I'm excited to dive in.
Awesome. So with that, we'll just sort of tee it up. What are some of the things that you have heard from clients, or some of the things that you've seen them do that might be ill-advised as it relates to, the project management tool and how that tries to solve for a lot of the operational challenges that people are looking to solve inside their agency?
Yeah, I think that the project management tool often is the first piece of software that someone will latch onto, someone being a leader, someone being a project manager, someone who's close to the leader or in a delivery role, to try and solve for some level of chaos that's happening or disorganization that's happening, where they're just feeling very granularly like they don't have a strong sense of organization and they'd like to change that. In addition, they also are hoping, because they've been promised through various different marketing campaigns for these tools, that this tool is going to solve for not only their delivery problems, but also give them some visibility into all these questions that they're trying to answer. So that's, your utilization, you'll be able to see that all of a sudden. You'll be able to tell where there are gaps in capacity, how much capacity people have, all these questions that sound like things that are missing. And I think they're all kind of marketed it in such a way that it's easy to kind of fall into this, trapper mindset that this project management tool is going to be this silver bullet that once installed, we've got the answers to not just kind of tame this day-to-day workflow and chaos, but also, installing the answers to all these questions and just addressing things across the board, both at the PM level and at the exec level. So that is a very common trap that I see, across agencies. Across the board.
Yeah. And I think you've raised an important thing here, which is it's easy for us to sit here, on our high horse and poo-poo on people that get excited about a project management tool and think like, oh, this is going to be great. Like, we're going to have all this visibility into projects and people and utilization and forecasting, but this is what they're being sold. And, and don't get me wrong, we have a lot of friends that own, that run, that work at these companies. They're great products. They're impressive. As a person that has built software, these are amazing tools. They're important. Everybody should have a project management platform. However, I do think it's fair to say that for the vast majority of these platforms, they are massively overselling their capabilities when it comes to the profit management side of the business. Or at the very least, I think you could argue that, and this makes sense, like, why would you put an asterisk on the website and then list out all of the requirements that are, for most firms, not feasible, that need to be met, and all of the edge cases and idiosyncrasies that you happen to have to just be able to like not deal with in order to actually get a lot of these outcomes that are being sold. And therein lies the problem. And I think there's people that are listening to this that might already be feeling some resistance to this idea. And then there's other people who have been doing this for a while and have reached that point in sort of like the experts curve where they've gone from sort of like unaware optimism to aware pessimism, where they've had enough experiences trying to implement a project management tool to realize that every one of them is going to be awesome in some ways. And then they're going to have this weird idiosyncrasy where like this field just doesn't show up in exports for no reason at all, or you can't link this tag to this tag, or there's a limit on how many of these fields you can use, or you can't put apostrophes in the naming convention for this one specific field for no reason at all, and it wasn't documented in the support docs. And like you always run into stuff like this that forces you to then try to like figure out workarounds, and in the end you end up with a bunch of stuff that you need and a whole bunch of stuff that is still not quite where it needs to be. So anyway, the rant has begun. We're going to keep ranting here for a little while, but moving on to kind of the next piece, knowing that a lot of these things are being sold to companies. I've talked about some of the reasons why it doesn't really work, but from your perspective, what are some of the biggest reasons that people who go down this path and try to like really go all in on the PM tool as the way to solve all these problems often end up coming up short or being frustrated by that experience?
Yeah. What I see really commonly is, for this PM tool to kind of get installed, and maybe they've seen some of the shortcomings that you're talking about or referenced, or maybe not. Maybe things have shown market improvement on the delivery side, but still, there's this like no man's land that people kind of find themselves in, where they are. They've got this PM tool in place, right? So some things are working better, but they've also got financial reports, and they've got a CRM, and they still have all this. They've got these sets of data, and they can't make the decisions they were hoping to be able to make by inserting this project management tool into the mix. So it's just finding themselves still kind of stuck, because what they're ultimately missing is a framework for understanding their business as a whole and really just uniting those sets of data to be able to make the right decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you've touched on something really important here, which is, again, project management tools are important. They're a part of the solution, and they have a role to play in here. And oftentimes it may make sense to like go roll something out, improve the rollout that you have currently, switch tools, whatever the case might be. But a lot of times I think the reaction to like really hyper fixating on a project management tool and looking to it and trying to hire it to solve like a very, very broad swath of problems is indicative of improper sequencing in approaching this problem, or in some cases, just sort of a perspective that's a little bit too narrow on the scope of this problem. It sort of represents almost like a bottom up mentality to solving the profit management problem. And what I think we see a lot of people run into is they get elbows deep into a rollout of a PM tool, and then all of a sudden they realize, like, wait a second, what metrics are we actually trying to track? And how do we calculate those? And how exactly do we define capacity inside of it, right? Because they're like sitting there in the project management tool and it's like, hey, what's the capacity of a person on your team? And they're like, that's an interesting question. We've never thought about that. And all of a sudden, you end up in this really difficult position where maybe you have this timeline and you said, we're going to get this live on September 1st and it's August 12th. And you're like, I just need to make a decision on this. And then all of a sudden you make a whole bunch of decisions that weren't thoughtful, that didn't consider the framework. Like you did things out of sequence. The answers to those questions should have been easy, but there wasn't the right work done before that. And there wasn't enough consideration of how that was going to affect things upstream. And then you sort of end up in this game of whack-a-mole where it's like, we're constantly having to go back and change the project management tool because we don't have this insight, or we have this limitation, or we didn't segment things properly. We didn't have the right schema, or the stakeholder's still not getting what they want, or the timeliness isn't there, or, and then it feels like this never ending battle. And then at some point, somebody comes in and goes, oh, well, the problem is we just didn't pick the right tool to begin with. Right. And we've seen this again where they're like, oh, we've been through 4 tools in 3 years. The team hates us and we really need to fix this. So with all of that in mind, I want to take a step back and sort of set the frame for the conversation, which comes back to our profit management model. In our opinion, there are kind of 3 key ingredients, and hopefully this will help people place sort of like, where does the project management tool actually fit into this? And the sequencing around this is the first thing that you mentioned, right? Which is the framework. Before we do anything regarding tools, the first question is, what is the framework that we are using to measure the business? And to make that a little bit more objective, we're talking about what metrics are we trying to track? How exactly do we calculate those metrics, right? Down to the precision of, exactly what is the formula for utilization, project profitability, gross margin, delivery margin, whatever those metrics are for you, exactly what's included in each object within that formula. Like, you got to get to that level of precision. And then what are the relationships between those metrics and our business, right? So what questions are they actually helping us answer? What does it mean if it goes up or if it goes down? What does that tell us about our business? How are these things related to each other? Are there any of these metrics that are going to be used to calculate other metrics, right? Are we clear on how this whole framework, like, that has to be the first step, because that's the objective. That's the outcome that all this stuff should be laddering up to. Once we have that, then we can go look at the data, which is, do we have the tools in place that could create the data necessary to reach those reporting outcomes? Do we have the right conventions inside of those tools to be able to produce data that's structured in a way that's going to work for those kinds of things? And are the tools configured, in such a way that they're going to be able to accomplish all the workflow objectives that our team has and still produce good data? And I think the important consideration there is it operationally feasible, right? And this is where there's often a lot of oversight, where we like design a system that theoretically should work, but then in practice, the team has to spend like 2 hours a day updating a bazillion tasks and making sure that there's like perfect compliance on having estimates on every single task and every single subtask and adding a tag to every single time entry. And like, you just never actually get the outcome because the requirements were kind of crazy to begin with. So that's kind of part two, is data. So we had framework, we had data. And then the last one, which is so overlooked, is process, which is like, okay, if we assume that the data is going to be messy, that things are going to change, and that, like, we're going to have to iterate on this, and someone's going to have to own taking the data from these tools and actually getting it into the right format on the right cadence and maintaining that against all the changes that are going to happen in the business. Do we have clarity on that? And specifically, that's data hygiene issues, which will exist, and we'll come back to that. Change management, which will happen, we can come back to that too. And then cadences, which is like, are we measuring these things on the right time horizons? And it's as important to make sure that we're doing it quickly enough so that on the weekly meeting, we have a weekly view into the metric that we're talking about, but also that we're not optimizing to a level of timeliness that is completely unnecessary and therefore a huge waste of time and energy, like trying to get a daily utilization rate calculation, which is like insanity and completely not useful. And I would argue not even insightful at all, but definitely very expensive and very operationally difficult to accomplish. So framework, data, process, and really the data is the only kind of part of the scope that a project management tool could feasibly solve for, and is really relevant to from our perspective.
Yeah. So you mentioned sequencing. Why is that so important, to go in that order? And where, when you don't sequence properly, what gaps does that illuminate?
Yeah, I mean, the most obvious example of this is all the decisions that you have to make when evaluating tools and implementing tools and then designing workflows around those things. If you don't have an understanding of what are the actual outputs that this needs to generate from a reporting perspective, how could you possibly make a decision about how someone's cost per hour is being defined inside of the project management tool, if you're going to use the project management tool to create that data, or if the project management tool even is the right place to have that data, or should it exist in a spreadsheet that's appended to people's actual payroll, right? Is that where you're going to draw that from? The same thing would be true about how you would define, for example, the objects on a project. What are the different buckets that you might track time against? What are the naming conventions for that? How do you actually structure projects? What are the names for those things, right? Like all of those decisions, how do you define people's capacity? What kind of, tags or roles or teams are you assigning them to? These are all the kinds of decisions you're going to have to make when you're implementing a time tracking or project management or resourcing. And you can't answer any of those questions unless you actually know, like, what are the requirements for our data? So you have this chicken and egg game but really it's quite obvious which one should come first. The first one that you should define is like, what are we actually trying to accomplish from a reporting perspective? But I think a lot of people either avoid or don't have that conversation because it's a really difficult conversation, especially if you're trying to just create your own framework. It's a very complex conversation. It took us years to accomplish that at Parakeeto, and we had the opportunity to do it dozens of times before we were able to get it like right from my perspective. And so I would encourage you to just borrow a framework that already exists, like ours, for example. But if you're not going to do that, or if our framework doesn't work for you, as hard as that is, it has to be the first conversation, in my opinion, because everything else downstream, including what tools you use, how you use them, how they're configured, what data comes out of them, how that data gets stitched together, what process you then need to apply to keep it clean, to keep it consistent, and to get it on the right cadences. You can't figure any of that stuff out until you're clear on what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah. So I think it's really clear, why we've made a case for why the framework is really important. And we're saying, hey, your project management tool is really going to capture that centerpiece, the data. And so where does that kind of leave things when it comes to process, and how can, agencies capture that back piece of the trifecta here?
Yeah, this is a really good question. It's a really important one. And there's two things I want to touch on here. The first is sort of the operational feasibility and precision piece, and then the other piece is data hygiene. And there are some people who are listening to this who might be thinking like, okay, well, if we already have the framework and we know how that's going to work, my project management tool is telling me on their website that, especially if you're going to more of like an all-in-one PSA type tool, the pitch for those tools is often like all of your reporting problems will be solved because all of your data will be in one place. And while, again, theoretically, that makes a lot of sense. And in some cases, some of your reporting problems may legitimately be solved or made much simpler because all the data is in one place. What is often not discussed is the data hygiene side of that. The critical assumption that a lot of that pitch is based on is that the data inputs are going to be of good enough quality to drive reporting. And therefore, the reporting can be done in real time. But the issue with that is two things. The data is not created in real time, in my experience. Most people don't track their time every day or on the same cadence. And most people are not perfectly compliant with naming conventions and, project hierarchies and structures. And even if they were, the idea that those things are going to remain static over long periods of time is also often not the case. So there, from my perspective, and this is not necessarily my opinion, this is just like an observation from the practice of data operations, which has existed for decades and has been done at big companies for a very long time. It's generally not a good practice to try to do reporting in the same place that you have source data. Most people use an ETL framework, which stands for extract, transform, and load, with the key idea being that there's a transform step, right? So that transform step is where you can fix things. Like there's 5 different ways that people are calling tasks design tasks. So if we want to measure how much design time was spent on projects, we need to take those 5 variations and consolidate them down to one, right? Or in the SOW, we structured this project as one project, but in the PM tool, we split it up into 6 phases. Well, we then need to be able to consolidate all of the data from those 6 phases into this one project, right? This is stuff that needs to happen. Or, hey, we used to structure projects this way, and then 6 months ago, we decided we're going to completely change how we structure projects, which is fine. But now we need to be able to map data from the old period to data to the new period. These are things that are going to occur. Project management tools often don't have any kind of capability to allow you to do those transformations. And therefore, the reporting outputs are going to be at the very least restricted. They're going to restrict you operationally from making those changes, but most of the time are just not going to be good or reliable. So that's sort of one key piece that you have to keep in mind around process is I don't think it's a very good assumption, and you're often going to set up your system to fail if you're building it on the assumption the data will be clean and consistent, because in my experience, it never is. And that's not a flaw in the project management tools. That's just sort of an inherent reality in managing data in any organization. And so I would encourage you to hire a project management tool to help your team do the work. And in some cases, having an all-in-one tool might be the best answer to that and get you a ton of efficiency in terms of workflows. And it might actually help improve the quality of your data in a lot of different ways. And in some cases, that might not be true. You might be better off actually having a stack of smaller, more disconnected, but best of breed tools. That that really should be the focus though, is like, is this helping us get the work done? And then assume that from a process perspective, you should have, and is a best process to have, best practice to have, an extraction of that data and a step where you can do transformations, normalizations, quality assurance, all the things that need to happen to get your data in a good state so that you can then report on it and make sure that it's accurate and complete. So like that's, I think, one important consideration. And doing that makes your whole system more redundant, and it makes it much more flexible, and it removes a lot of the tension that emerges when you're implementing PM tools, which is the project management team or the operations team. One of you has to make a compromise, because in order to get either the workflow that the PM team wants or the data that the ops team wants, somebody has to give something up, right? You can remove a lot of those tensions by giving yourself a transform step where everybody can kind of have their cake and eat it too. So that's point one. We'll come back to the precision thing, but I think that's an important one. Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
Yeah. No, you mentioned you're actually hitting on something super important, which is the trade-off, based on the role. So, your PM really wants this precise set of data, to understand granularly what's happening on the day-to-day, the ability to resource, make all the decisions that they have to make at any given time, versus your operator who really needs to have a much more simplistic data set to be able to, look at things at a higher level and on a longer time horizon, with just a broad sense of accuracy, as opposed to that really specific, and accurate or precise set of data for a PM.
Yeah. Yeah. And you see this show up in all kinds of different ways too. Like, in some organizations where you have like a very creative side of the business and you have a very engineering focused side of the business, like you might find that they want to use the tools completely differently. In some cases, they might even want to use completely different tools. And that's actually like, that does make sense that the engineering team is on Jira and the creative team is on Asana. And we've seen this before, right? And so like from an operations perspective and from a workflow perspective, that might make a lot of sense. But you could imagine that maybe the ops person that has this dream in their mind that like all the data is in one place and it's flowing together and all our reporting are automated, that might make them want to rip their hair out. And so it's like, well, actually those things don't have to be in tension with one another. They can coexist, and you can enable that without having to compromise on your visibility. But you do that through this architecture. You just touched on the next thing, which I think is important to talk about here, which is the precision trap. And we've talked about this a lot, but this is sort of pointing to the thing that you just called out, which is the different needs of the stakeholders in the business. And when I think about a project management platform, the first and most important job that tool is doing is managing projects. And in a lot of cases, that is a highly precise exercise, right? And for a project manager to do that well, they may need to break things down into a lot of different increments and tasks and be looking at things, at a very granular level. And there might be a lot of complexity in that. And they may need to take a project and split it up into a very different set of, milestones and tasks and subtasks and phases and whatever in the tool to get the visibility that they need to do their job, than how you have this in QuickBooks or how it's being invoiced or how it's being measured at the executive or the finance level, right? So like those differences are not necessarily indicative of a problem. They might just sort of be inherent. And where we see a lot of firms get into a lot of trouble is in order to enable effective project management and then somehow directly connect that to executive level reporting, you end up with a set of constraints that are completely unfeasible. And so I'll give you an example of this. Let's say, for example, you want to measure all of your projects and you want to know what the profitability of those projects are. And you want to be able to segment that by different service lines that you have. And then you also want to be able to see where you went over budget across a bunch of different role categories. In a world where you're trying to accomplish all of that directly inside of a project management tool, and let's say you want to forecast on top of that, right? You think about like, what is all the information now that needs to exist on every time entry inside of the project management tool, and what needs to be maintained, right? So now you have the situation where every time entry needs to have this information on it, which means that every task probably is going to need a time estimate, actual time tracked against it. It's going to need to be tied back to a certain kind of project naming convention. You're probably going to need to apply tags to figure out like what category this time falls into. You're probably also going to need to be managing the scope in the correct way and have some way of assigning value to the project or to time, right? And that framework may not actually align to how you run your projects, depending on what tool you're using and what their limitations are. You're also going to need to have some concept of like the cost per hour of the individual, and that's going to have to be maintained against changes over time. And depending on what tool you're using, when you make an update to that, it may just retroactively change all your historical data, or it might not, right? So like, and all of that needs to be maintained perfectly all the time. And if your executive team wants to go in and look at a report of how everything's performing, you need globally consistent data, meaning like you have to be on top of that shit all the time. And so, like, what team on earth is going to be able to accomplish that? Not a lot, right? And our perspective on this is, well, actually, like, what if the executive team could get all of that visibility and the PM team didn't have to worry about the majority of that stuff, right? And they could just kind of do whatever they need to do and we could still get that outcome. And this is where I think things like joins are really powerful, where it's like, I don't actually need you to put any information into the project management tool about someone's cost, about a project, or about what role they're in, because I can go get that information from other sources and stitch it into a time entry in my transform step. So all you need in the project management tool, my only requirements are, we need to know the project name, we need to know the person, and we need to know how many hours were tracked. That's it. You could do whatever the hell you want after that. As long as we can get that information out, we can get the reporting outcome, because I can go figure out how much that person costs because I have their payroll information. And on that payroll information, I know what department they're in. So that tells me what category the time goes to. And I can go get all the information I need about the project from my project grid, which contains information about who the client is, how much we're being paid, how much is, estimated on that thing, right? And I don't need to ask the project management team to manage all of that detail and then spread it across 300 different things when I could just actually have it tied to one object, right? So these are the things that I think people don't consider, is like, that's the benefit of actually not trying to load all of this into the project management tool, where you're exploding the complexity and therefore the cost of maintaining the data set. And effectively, what you're trying to do when you do that in the project management tool is like build a sandcastle by asking the PM team to spend all day with a set of tweezers trying to stack little grains of sand on top of each other. And every time something changes, the whole thing comes tumbling down. It's like, well, theoretically that could work, but for most teams, it's just not going to work in practice.
Yeah. No, I for sure have seen more little, reporting graveyards than I can count within project management systems that just have blown up sets of data and kind of like half complete reports. And unfortunately, what that really does, is kind of erode the trust in the system, even at a fundamental level, just because they think they can't, even though they probably can trust to some degree some of the data that's being generated in there, it's just not being collected and reported upon because it's missing a tag or it's missing a this. And so just at the end of that flow, it's incomplete and not a trustworthy, representation of what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm. And I think, like, you're not going to call this out, but I will. We had an experience recently, right, of a client that came to us after having worked with another firm, and that firm helped them install profitability reporting inside of their project management tool, specifically inside of ClickUp, which is an incredibly capable platform. And similarly, like, when we looked at it, we were like, well, theoretically, this would be awesome. However, the client was getting no value out of that reporting because their team was completely incapable of keeping all of the stuff up to date that was needed. And this report relied on globally consistent data. So if one project was out of whack, then their measure of this metric for the whole business was completely out of whack. Right. So it's like the reporting system was built on a house of cards and a set of assumptions that was just not reasonable to begin with. And I think, like, you cannot overlook that. I can't stress enough how important that is and how many firms we see fail, not because the theoretical system wasn't feasible, but just like operationally, it was built on a bunch of assumptions that were incredibly risky and ultimately set it up for failure.
Yeah, and I think that it can't be understated the amount of friction it can also cause on the day-to-day level. Just not just with the project manager who's tasked with spinning up something new every time a piece of new business comes in the door, but really just managing the inputs, managing anyone else who's touching that system, making sure that everything is staying intact, and it really can impact the ability to execute the work itself because someone's hung up on a specific step or a certain where do I track this or how do I tell where I'm going, to isolate what I'm supposed to do? Just a level of complexity, certainly when you're trying to accomplish all that in one place in the PM tool.
Yeah. Oh, and you've raised such a good point here, which I think is so important. It's one thing to load this complexity onto project managers, right? And this happens a lot. And in some cases, we unfortunately see a lot of PMs that maybe they're growing in their career and they've been sort of going through the typical path that a PM often goes through, which is like they're the PM, and then all of a sudden they're like the PM that's been around the longest, and the company's growing. They need someone to take on ops, so like they sort of step up into that role, and they're doing it for the first time, and then they're like, "Hey, you're going to be in charge of rolling out the PM tool," and they get all excited, and it's a big opportunity for them, and then they sort of like build themselves a cage that they then have to live in where they're like, oh shit, I set up this system that's so fucking complex and takes so much time to maintain, but if I don't do it, then the project fails and then I fail. And it's like they sort of like put themselves in a set of golden handcuffs by building this incredibly complex system that is relying on globally consistent data. But the other thing that this often does is it pushes a bunch of complexity to the team, and it just absolutely annihilates time tracking compliance. And there is just this punishing exponential curve to the amount of thinking that someone has to do to log their time and how likely they are to actually do it and do it well. So where this typically shows up is the kinds of questions that you have to answer when you log time, which is like, if you have to ask a person to determine which, for example, task category does this time belong to? Is this design time? Is it, engineering time? Is it strategy time? Is it whatever? Well, if I was just in a design strategy meeting with the engineering team, and then I'm sitting in front of my timesheets, like this is actually not a very obvious question. And if I have to think through 12 of those kinds of decisions every week when I log my time, that is going to have a massive cost to time tracking compliance. In the same way that if the project gets broken out into 17 phases, and now all of a sudden it's like, well, what phase are we actually in right now? Like this is kind of related to the last phase, but on a timeline basis, we're in this phase. But this task was sort of like this thing that got punted over for revisions from this other phase, right? So the more sort of precision that you layer into time tracking and ask your team to do, and this is sort of like the inherent cost of trying to do it all in the PM tool as opposed to relying on other sets of data that you can stitch in, your time tracking compliance is going to get annihilated by that. You would be amazed at how much that psychological friction just decimates compliance. But it makes sense, right? It like significantly increases the mental load that's required for a person to sit down and do this thing that you think is simple, but then in practice actually ends up being not that easy. And they're often not the right people to be trying to make those decisions anyway. And it's very hard, the more precise you get, to create clear enough guidelines on how to think about those things and get compliance across the team. So let's say people just do time tracking compliance because you're sufficiently militant about it. What are the chances that they're actually putting data into the right place versus just saying like, whatever, I'll just put it here, good enough. Like I just need to get my time in and move on so that Kristen isn't up my butt on Monday about not getting my timesheets done. So don't underestimate that. And there's a very, very low threshold before you start to have a big impact there.
So we're talking a lot about, stitching in, joining with an external source. And I think it would be helpful for us to kind of just provide a little bit more detail in terms of how that actually works, whether it's with Parakeeto or not. How does that really, what does that look like for someone who's just like, well, look, I thought this PM tool was the thing. And so now it's, what is the other thing that brings this full circle to a helpful point?
Yeah. Okay. It's a good question. So I'll sort of address really at a high level the question that we get asked a lot, which is like, what's the difference between Parakeeto and a project management tool? And like, what do we actually do? And the way I would describe the difference between that is it's like, let's say you wanted to build a house. In this case, the house is solving the profit management problem in the business. And before, actually, let's take another step back. What is profit management? It's that job that someone has to do in the business. Maybe someone is doing it in your business, or maybe someone is doing it, but they're not aware that they're doing it. And it's sitting between finance, operations and delivery, and sales, and bringing all that data together to answer the questions that you got to answer every day to run the business. Like, are we making money on stuff that we sell? Are we charging enough? Are we over under servicing? Is our team busy enough? Do we need to hire people? What does our forecast look like? Right. Those are the kinds of questions that you need all that data for. So solving that profit management problem and having that data when you need it for the right stakeholders, making sure it's accurate, that's the job. Right. So if we agree that like that's the problem that needs to get solved, the difference between Parakeeto and a PM tool would be like if you were building a house, Parakeeto would be like the firm that you go and hire, and we're going to do the architecture drawings and bring in the contractors and like the entire strategy, right? The framework, what materials do we need? How do we configure all this out? And then we actually build the house. Versus a PM tool is kind of like you going to the hardware store and being like, give me all the things I would theoretically need to build a house, and then going back to an empty lot and then trying to do it yourself. That's essentially the difference. A PM tool is a tool. And of course, we're going to be involved in sort of the data and the PM tool that you're using. But what we're really bringing to the table is the entire solution to that problem, which is making sure we're clear on the framework, making sure you have the right data being produced, and then actually running the process that gets that data into a set of reports that is aligned to that framework, on top of actually coaching you on that data. So that's the difference between us and them. And then the other question that you had asked was, what does the process actually look like? And I'll sort of describe what it looks like for us, but also just like generally what it looks like when you're building a data pipeline and the examples that we see in the wild. The way that we do this is we run an ETL process. So of course, we have our implementation phase where we're running through the strategic part of this, which is defining the framework, having a look at the tools, and figuring out like what needs to be true to get this client's data into this format so they can see what they need to see when they need to see it. And then we spin up a reporting system and we set up essentially a mini data pipeline. And it's fun, we were just working on this yesterday. There's sort of 3 essential steps to that process. The first is data cleanup. So we ingest time tracking data from their system and we clean it up. So, hey, there's 5 different ways that design is being named. Let's clean that up. Oh, this person's name is misspelled or spelled differently in a couple different places. Let's clean that up. Oh, this project was broken up into 9 different phases in the project management tool, but it's actually just one thing that we're trying to measure. Let's clean that up. Oh, people's names are formatted strangely in this time tracking data set. Let's clean that up. Or, hey, the date format was different in the old time tracking tool versus the new time tracking tool. Let's clean that up. So step 1 is data cleanup rules. And that can be done to clean a whole bunch of different things up that we see. We could talk for hours about all the mistakes that show up and all the changes that happen there. Phase 2 is when we get into joins. So as part of what we do in this system, we create 2 important tables. One is what we call the project grid, and the other is what we call the payroll grid. And these are tables where we maintain information about people, including their cost, what departments or roles they belong to, therefore where their time should be categorized, when they start, when they end, how much time off they get, what their capacity is, right? And we can use that to inform a whole bunch of different reports. And then the other table is the project grid, and the project grid contains all the information about projects. When does it start? When does it end? How much do we get paid? How much of that money is hours? What do we expect the margin to be on that project? How much time are we estimating for it? So when we pull time tracking data from whatever the source is, again, we only need a very, very small amount of information. Who's the person? What's the project? How much time was logged? And then we join data from the project grid and the payroll grid to get all the rest of the metadata that's needed to drive all the reports that we're going to do downstream, like project performance and profitability, utilization, all of those kinds of things. So that's sort of step 3. And then step 4 is normalization, right? So we have a set of frameworks that feeds into all of our reports, and there's a very specific format that those need to fall into. So the last step is saying, okay, well, in their time tracking platform, the column is called project phase name. And in our platform, it's just called project. So that last step is really simple. It's like, look at this column called this, and that's what you're going to use for project. In the project management tool, the thing is called team member. In our system, it's called employee. So look at the team member column, that's going to be employee. So those are at a high level, sort of the 3 major things that we're doing in our data pipeline. And those, you can be doing those same things. And a lot of people are just doing this in a spreadsheet as a starting point. More advanced teams that do have some data operations capabilities might use data operations tools to do this, to build their data pipelines. Um, and how feasible that is with some of the off-the-shelf tools that you can find on the internet really comes down to how complex your situation is. There are some things that we're doing that are just like, you can't just do that in Zapier, or you can't just do it in some of these sort of more generic tools that you might use to stitch data together. But if your implementation is fairly simple, you may be able to set this up in such a way where you can use some Excel formulas, or some things like that to do this kind of transformation. But the thing to keep in mind is it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. You will need to maintain these over time, because there will be changes both upstream and downstream that you'll likely have to account for, like the naming convention changed, we decided to change time tracking tools, we decided to change how we set things up, etc. But at a high level, that's sort of the process that we're using to actually take data from the PM tools, or from all the different places that it might exist, get it structured in a way that we can report on it reliably, and then pipe it into our systems. And the thing that I didn't call out there, but I think is important to note, is we also have a quality assurance step. So we have a person that every time the data is pulled, looks through a report that is generated, that finds all kinds of problems in the data, and then goes and fixes them, in the same way that your bookkeeper every month is going to come up with a list of transactions that we've never seen before, and then figure out where do we need to put these for this to be accurate.
Yeah. I've seen this in practice, and I think every client that we work with, on this process really feels a great deal of relief, knowing that that's a responsibility that's been removed from their plate and then pulled out of that actual system where it just hasn't had a high degree of success. It's not reliable, and that's really the visibility they're looking for, and confidence.
And I think what's also a relief for clients is that we often remove a lot of constraints that have existed before, where the PM team is just like, oh, so like that's all you need? You just need person, time, and project? Easy. And oh, like I can kind of set up the project name up like in all these different ways, and you guys can just like tie it back to the, okay, great. And it's like we free them up to kind of work in the way that they want, and remove I think a lot of the constraints and a lot of the requirements that they had before. Or conversely, we simplify things, in that like they no longer have to try to come up with ways to accomplish all of these specific data requirements in the tool. And I think that can be a really big relief for them. It's like, we just don't have to deal with all of this stuff anymore, and we can just keep things simple and sort of be flexible and still get the outcomes that we want. And we also don't have to be worrying about, every time we change something, thinking through all the different ways in how that's going to impact the system. That becomes our job.
Yeah. Yeah, and even just to bring it full circle, talking about relief, I think, once agencies do understand, that the framework is the key to unlocking the insight, that is, the other piece that we execute and help them think through, in order to just make the most of the data that they're getting out of that project management tool in the center of this whole thing.
Yeah, 100%. All right, we've talked about this for a while, and we have another call to get to, Kristen, so I guess we should probably wrap this up. So with that, the TLDR, I think, and the big takeaway that I hope people take away from this, is project management tools are important. They're a piece of the solution, but they're probably not the whole solution. And my belief, my experience, what I've observed, having done this for 7 years and seen hundreds of people try to accomplish this, is hiring your project management tool to solve all your reporting problems is probably setting you up for failure. So I would just advise you to not try to do that. Use it to run your projects, and definitely have one and invest heavily in it. But maybe think a little bit more holistically about how you're going to accomplish the reporting outcomes. All right, that's it. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you on the next one.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.